Alex had always been drawn to old things, especially objects with history and character. His weekends were often spent scouring flea markets and antique shops, hoping to find some forgotten relic that told a story. That's how he found himself in the small, dimly lit store on the edge of town, a place filled with dust and the scent of old wood. As he wandered through the narrow aisles, something caught his eye, a vintage camera resting on a shelf, partially hidden behind a stack of old books. The camera was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a relic from another era. Its body was made of dark, polished wood, and the lens was encased in brass. Alex felt an inexplicable pull towards it, as if the camera itself was calling to him. He reached out, running his fingers over the worn leather strap and feeling the weight of it in his hand. The store owner, an elderly man with a knowing smile, approached him. "Ah, you have an eye for the unique," the old man said, his voice raspy and low. "That camera has a bit of a history. It's been passed around for years, but no one seems to keep it for long." Curious, Alex asked, "Why's that? What's wrong with it?" The old man's smile faded, replaced by a more somber expression. "Some say it's cursed. People who've owned it claim it captures more than just pictures, it captures something from the soul. But, of course, that's just a story. Still, if you want it, I'll let it go for cheap." Despite the eerie warning, Alex's fascination only grew. He bought the camera, thinking the old man's tale was just an attempt to add mystery and inflate its value. That evening, eager to see what the camera could do, he began taking photos around his house. The camera worked perfectly, despite its age. The pictures, however, were another story. When Alex developed the film in his makeshift darkroom, he noticed something strange. An unsettling haze or shadow seemed to hover around the edges of each photograph, something he hadn't seen when he took them. He brushed it off as a trick of the light, maybe a flaw in the old lens. But as he looked closer, he realized the shadows almost seemed to be moving. A chill ran down his spine, but he shook it off. It was late, and his eyes were probably just tired. But as he turned off the lights and went to bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him from the dark corners of his room. The next morning, Alex woke up feeling uneasy. He couldn't shake off the strange feeling from the night before. The camera sat on his desk, almost as if it were watching him. He tried to ignore it, but something about the photos he had taken gnawed at him. Curiosity getting the better of him, Alex decided to take the camera out into town, hoping that in daylight, his fears would seem foolish. He snapped pictures of people in the park, children playing, dogs chasing after balls, and an elderly couple sharing a quiet moment on a bench. When he returned home and developed the new photos, his blood ran cold. The same shadowy figures were there, hovering around the people he had photographed. This time, they were clearer, almost like silhouettes standing just behind his subjects. One figure, in particular, seemed to have its hand reaching out toward a child's shoulder. Alex felt a cold sweat form on his brow. These shadows were not a trick of the light, they were something else entirely. Over the next few days, Alex's unease turned into a creeping dread. He began hearing whispers in his apartment at night, soft and indistinguishable, like a distant conversation that he couldn't quite make out. Objects around his home seemed to move on their own, shifting slightly when he wasn't looking. His sleep was plagued by nightmares of being surrounded by faceless figures, their hands outstretched, reaching for him. The camera seemed to be the source of it all, but every time he thought about getting rid of it, a strange compulsion would stop him. His friends began noticing his change in behavior. Emily, his closest friend, asked him one day if everything was all right. "You've been acting weird lately, Alex. Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, concern evident in her eyes. "I'm fine," he lied, trying to sound convincing. "Just been a little tired, that's all." But he wasn't fine. He felt like he was being watched constantly, not just by the camera, but by something else, something unseen and sinister. Desperate for answers, Alex started researching the camera's history, diving into old newspapers and online forums. He found stories about previous owners, photographers who had all met grim fates. Some had disappeared without a trace, while others were found dead in their homes, surrounded by their photographs. There were even accounts of some going insane, ranting about shadows and ghosts before taking their own lives. One story, in particular, stood out to him, a famous photographer from the 1920s who had claimed the camera could capture the soul. He had written extensively about the shadows in his photos, describing them as souls trapped between worlds. Alex's heart pounded as he read the final lines of the article. The photographer had vanished, leaving behind a cryptic note: "They are in the photographs. They want to be free." Alex felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't help but think of the shadows in his own photographs, the way they seemed to be reaching out, trying to touch the living. The thought made his skin crawl. He knew he had to do something, but what? The camera seemed indestructible, and he wasn't sure if destroying it would even help. The whispers in his apartment grew louder at night, almost as if they were coming from the photographs themselves. He began to notice a dark figure appearing in the corners of his vision, just at the edge of the light, vanishing whenever he turned to look directly at it. His paranoia deepened. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality. Was he seeing things, or was something really there? One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare, Alex woke up to find every photograph he had taken with the camera spread out across his living room floor. In the center was a single photo he didn't recognize, one of himself, asleep in his bed, a dark figure standing over him, its hand reaching for his face. The camera was on the floor beside him, the lens pointing directly at him. Panic surged through him as he realized the truth. Whatever was in the camera wasn't just watching him, it was coming for him. Alex's days began to blur together, each one marked by the same oppressive sense of dread. The shadows in his photographs were becoming more distinct, more menacing. He started to notice them in real life, too, dark figures lurking in the corners of his vision, always just out of focus. They seemed to be getting closer, their presence more palpable with each passing day. He felt as though he was being hunted, but he couldn't bring himself to tell anyone about it. How could he explain that he was being stalked by shadows? His sleep, already fitful, became nearly non-existent. When he did manage to doze off, he was tormented by nightmares of being trapped in a dark room with no doors or windows, just endless walls covered in photographs. Each photo showed someone he knew, their faces twisted in expressions of terror and pain, with shadowy figures looming over them. In the dream, he would try to scream, but no sound would come out. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as if he'd been running for his life. The camera, once a curious relic, now seemed like a malevolent presence in his home. He could feel it watching him, its lens like an unblinking eye. He tried to avoid looking at it, but it was always there, on the periphery of his vision. Every time he thought about getting rid of it, a voice in the back of his mind whispered that it was too late, that he was already too far gone. He had become obsessed with understanding the camera, believing that knowledge might somehow save him. Alex spent hours in his darkroom, poring over the photographs he'd taken, looking for any clue that might help him understand what was happening. He noticed that the shadows were always in the same position, always reaching out toward the people in the photos, as if trying to pull them in. The realization made his stomach churn. Were these shadows the trapped souls the old photographer had written about? Were they trying to escape the photographs, or were they trying to drag others in with them? His friends became increasingly worried. Emily, in particular, could see the toll it was taking on him. She visited more often, trying to get him out of the house, but Alex always found an excuse to stay in. He didn't want to admit it, but he was afraid to leave. What if the shadows followed him? What if he couldn't get away from them? He didn't know what was real anymore, and the uncertainty was driving him mad. One evening, Emily confronted him. "Alex, you need help," she pleaded. "Whatever is going on with you, it's not normal. You're scaring me. Please, just tell me what's happening." He wanted to tell her everything, but the words wouldn't come. He was terrified she wouldn't believe him, or worse, that she would, and then she'd be dragged into this nightmare with him. He shook his head, avoiding her eyes. "I'm fine, Em. Really. I just need to figure some things out on my own." Frustrated, Emily left, but not before making him promise to call her if he needed anything. As soon as she was gone, the oppressive silence of his apartment seemed to close in around him. The whispers returned, louder now, almost angry. The shadows seemed to dance at the edges of his vision, taunting him. He felt like he was losing his mind. Desperate for answers, Alex decided to take more photos, hoping to capture something that would explain what was happening. He grabbed the camera and stepped outside, aiming it at random people passing by. Each click of the shutter felt like a stab of guilt, but he couldn't stop. He needed to know. When he returned to his apartment and developed the film, his hands trembled. The new photos were worse than the others. The shadows were no longer just figures, they had faces now, grotesque and contorted, eyes like empty voids. One shadow in particular stood out, a woman with a twisted smile, her hand reaching out as if to pull someone into the darkness. Alex recognized her. She was one of the people he had photographed in the park the other day. He felt a cold wave of terror wash over him. What had he done? Panic set in as he realized the gravity of his actions. Every person he had photographed was now in danger. He had to warn them, but how could he explain without sounding insane? The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices echoing in his mind. He clutched his head, trying to drown out the noise, but it was no use. The shadows were everywhere, closing in on him. He could feel their cold, clammy touch on his skin, their breath on his neck. With a surge of adrenaline, he grabbed the camera and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a heavy thud but remained intact. The voices stopped suddenly, replaced by a deep, guttural laugh that seemed to emanate from the camera itself. Alex stumbled back, horrified. He realized then that there was no escaping this. The camera had him, and it wasn't going to let go. Alex's desperation reached a breaking point. The camera, now undeniably a source of evil, had to be destroyed. He couldn't bear another night with the shadows creeping closer, nor the voices growing louder, filling his apartment with their maddening whispers. Grabbing the camera, he decided to do whatever it took to end this nightmare. He started with the simplest idea, throwing it in the trash. He tossed it into a heavy-duty garbage bag, tied it up tightly, and hurled it into the dumpster behind his building. He walked away, feeling a brief moment of relief. But that night, he awoke to a chilling realization. The camera was back, sitting on his bedside table as if it had never left. His heart raced, and his breathing became erratic. He swore he had thrown it away, but here it was, pristine and untouched. Panic surged through him, but he refused to let the fear control him. He decided to try a more forceful approach. Alex grabbed a hammer from his kitchen drawer and brought it down on the camera with all his might. The force of the blow sent a shockwave up his arm, but the camera remained unscathed. It didn't even have a scratch. He swung again, harder this time, but the result was the same. The camera was impervious, almost mocking him with its resilience. Each failed attempt to destroy it only deepened his despair. Determined not to give up, he decided to burn it. He took the camera to his bathtub, doused it in lighter fluid, and lit a match. The flames roared to life, engulfing the camera in a blaze of heat and light. For a moment, he thought it might actually work, but as the flames died down, he saw the camera sitting there, perfectly intact amidst the charred remnants of his bathtub. A wave of hopelessness washed over him. He knew then that this wasn't just any object, it was something much darker, something otherworldly. Each attempt to destroy it seemed to strengthen its hold over him. The shadows in his apartment grew bolder, no longer confined to the corners but moving freely, drifting like dark mist through the rooms. The whispers turned into screams, a chorus of anguish that filled every inch of his mind. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of despair. In a final act of desperation, Alex decided to consult a local priest, hoping that perhaps a blessing or exorcism could rid him of this curse. The priest listened patiently as Alex recounted his ordeal, the fear and desperation evident in his voice. The old man nodded solemnly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the camera. "This is no ordinary possession," the priest said. "It's an object of pure malevolence, designed to trap souls and feed on their suffering. Destroying it may not be possible, but we can try to contain it." They performed a ritual, using holy water, prayers, and candles. The priest chanted in Latin, his voice rising and falling like a wave. For a moment, Alex felt a sliver of hope. But then the shadows in the room began to writhe and twist, as if they were laughing. The candles flickered violently, and a sudden gust of cold wind blew them out. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the eerie glow emanating from the camera's lens. A deep, menacing voice echoed through the room, emanating from the camera. "You cannot stop us," it growled. "We are many, and we are hungry." The priest staggered back, his face pale and his hands trembling. He looked at Alex, fear in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "There's nothing more I can do." Defeated, Alex returned home, the weight of despair pressing down on him like a lead blanket. He felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The camera sat on his desk, its lens staring at him like an unblinking eye. He knew now that it wouldn't stop until it had claimed him too. In a final, desperate attempt to break the curse, Alex decided to turn the camera on himself. He set it up on a tripod, aimed directly at his face, and set the timer. As the seconds ticked away, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as if he were finally accepting his fate. The shutter clicked, and the room was flooded with a blinding white light. When the light faded, Alex was gone. The camera remained on the tripod, its lens now fogged and cracked, but still whole. On the floor, where Alex had stood, lay a single photograph. It showed Alex standing in his living room, a look of terror on his face, with dark shadows swirling around him, pulling him into the abyss. The camera now waits in silence, its hunger temporarily sated but never truly satisfied. As time passes, dust begins to settle on its polished surface, but the lens remains clean, ever watchful, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to come along and release it from its dark prison. And so, the cursed cycle begins again.